I think it's useful to spend a little time in some of the background that is involved in understanding them. And yesterday we began that by discussing something, which was the mode of thought, and therefore the attitude that is necessary in approaching this study. But I think that many people do want to know, well, where did this material come from? What is the source of it? We have the name of H.P. Blavatsky. Who was she? Now, obviously, I can't cover, nor do I intend to, neither her life, just in a biographical manner, nor really who she was, so far as the tradition may indicate, the kind of person that she was. But in addition to the fact that her name appears on the volumes, she acknowledged that there were others who not only assisted her, but who took a direct hand in the writing of these volumes. But in addition to that, is there any validity, any legitimacy in her statements with regard to the source from which she drew the material? And that, it seems to me, may be useful to look at, and then to understand, if we can this morning, something of the scope and the structure of these two volumes. As I indicated yesterday, they are written in a unique manner. They are not written in, as most books are written, if I can put it that way. And this, of course, often causes trouble for the student. You open it and you look into it and you start reading it from page 1 to page 1001, whatever it is. These are two long volumes. And you say it seems very confusing, very chaotic. It seems at times a mishmash. She starts to talk about one thing and then she goes off into something else. She brings in material which seems irrelevant at the time. She comes back to point A, pages down, and so on. All of this, as I suggested yesterday, is really to awaken a new mode of thought in us, to stimulate by clues, by hints, a kind of interior awakening of true spiritual perception. Now, I think also we have to take her words for what she was attempting. In an article that appeared in her journal Lucifer, which was the journal that she started in London after she went there to live, in an article which appeared in October 1889, which is therefore a year after the appearance of these volumes, she says, "What I do believe in is," and she gives three things that she believes in. And these are essential. Let me make this point. Whether you accept them or not is irrelevant. The point that is absolutely relevant is that this was reality for her. And there is a distinction, you see. We can say, well, I don't agree with what she accepted. That is irrelevant. You may not agree with it. But for her, it was a reality. And so one has to start from that point of view. So she says, what I do believe in is, first, the unbroken oral teachings revealed by living divine men during the infancy of mankind to the elect among men. So this is the first, an unbroken oral teaching or tradition revealed by living men, divine men. She, of course, referred to them as masters. They have been called Mahatmas. They have been called adepts. There are many terms. These are also the rishis and sages of India, the wise men of all cultures. Second, she says, she believes that it has reached us unaltered. That is to say that there is this living tradition to which she was a party because of her occult status. And therefore, within that tradition, within the mystery schools, it has reached us unaltered. Now, it has certainly been tampered with, one may say, since, of course. It is, the moment it is written down, that is a kind of tampering with the oral tradition, in a sense, because the moment you write something down, you have interpreted what it meant, haven't you? You have given it your own language when you write it down. You can say, well, I just wrote down the oral teaching. I just wrote down what I heard. But even in that, because, remember what we had on the board yesterday of the modes of thought and what she calls these modes of interpretation, which were parabolical, emblematical, symbolic, and so on, you remember, all of those. So we move from the hieroglyphical, you see, in which, remember, that the very term hieroglyph has to do with a sacred symbol. Hiero is sacred, glyph is a symbol, a certain marking that has a sacred meaning, that has an interior meaning, has an esoteric meaning, you see. And then third, she says, that the masters are thoroughly versed in the science based on such uninterrupted teaching. So here are the three things that we have to look at. That there is an unbroken oral teaching, that it has reached us unaltered, if we can understand it. And third, that there are individuals to whom she refers as masters, as Mahatmas. These are her teachers, and again I will stress, whether you accept that there are such teachers is utterly irrelevant. The point is that she acknowledged them, that she said that she was in touch with them, that there is independent evidence of their existence, independent of HPB, there is independent evidence, and for all of that story, there is no book better, and I think it's one of the greatest contributions to theosophical literature, better to understand all of this than Virginia Hansen's Masters and Men, and which gives this whole story, and that there is independent evidence. So that there are individuals who are versed in this science based on this uninterrupted teaching. And so she points out in volume 1, in the very introductory statement, that the Secret Doctrine is not a treatise or a series of vague theories, but contains all that can be given out to the world in this century. And of course she indicates there too that perhaps in the 20th century someone else may give out further teachings. And it's interesting because that I suppose we could debate for a long time. There are many people who say, well, so-and-so has given further teachings, so-and-so has given. My question always of all of these is, are there really deeper teachings, or are there simply extrapolations of these fundamental principles? And be very careful, because if there are indeed further, what shall we say, principles, further fundamental propositions enunciated, then they must be looked at very closely. But if the statements that are given out by channeling and all the other parapsychological and superphysical and psychic and so on media today, are they really pointing to deeper truths, to additional propositions, or are they simply sort of building on what has already been given in, for example, the three fundamental propositions on which this entire work is based? Three absolute propositions which are fundamental to the metaphysics that HPB was presenting, and which are given, as you know, in the proem of the Secret Doctrine. The presence in the universe, the presence underlying the universe of a fundamental reality, the absolute, about which nothing can really be said, but which can be symbolized under a dual aspect. But a fundamental reality, and this of course is the first fundamental proposition, as you'll remember. The second fundamental proposition, a law of periodicity, the comings and goings of systems which are manifestations of that one underlying reality, none of which then express that underlying reality in its fullness. And the third, that there is an absolute unity of every part thereof in that manifested system with the underlying unity. Fundamental propositions that we have to really grapple with. So these indeed are not vague theories. These are, as she says, it contains all that can be given out to the world in this century. Towards the end of the second volume of the Secret Doctrine, she says, once the sagacious student gets hold of the guiding thread, he may find it out for himself, these ideas. And of course, the guiding thread she has spoken of as analogy, correspondences. And so she says, we give facts and show landmarks. Let the wayfarer follow them. What is given here is amply sufficient for this century. So we come back then to what are these sources. And to appreciate, I think, what we may call the archetypal principles or concepts which constitute modern theosophy, and to understand the basis, therefore, on which the esoteric philosophy rests, it is useful to examine to some extent, as I say, the sources of this knowledge. The ultimate validity, remember, as I said yesterday, the ultimate validity rests with each one of us. That is, they are testable. They are verifiable in terms of our lives. Maybe not in one incarnation, but they are verifiable. They are testable. And therefore, and also it must rest on our own intuitive and spiritual perception. Now, we have within the volumes themselves a number of statements as to the sources of the Secret Doctrine. HPB was as open as I suppose she could be within the limits of the vows that she had probably taken as a high initiate in the mystery tradition. Vows, incidentally, whose faint reflection we have in Freemasonry today, for example, and in many other schools, but certainly in Masonic fraternities. But as we examine her statements, I think we should keep in mind something that is said, referred yesterday to the book by Sri Krishna Prem and Sri Madhava Ashish, Man, the Measure of All Things. And as I pointed out yesterday, I think this is perhaps one of the finest modern, contemporary expositions, commentaries on the stanzas of Volume 1 of the Secret Doctrine. Neither of these men being members of the Theosophical Society. But they make a statement which I think is extremely interesting. Speaking of the origin of these stanzas, they point out that they derive ultimately from the vision of a seer, and they say, this particular collection of verses, behind whose obscurity we had sensed a profundity of meaning and a universality of application beyond anything sanctified by the joint approval of Orthodox scholarship and Orthodox religion. One senses that, one deals with this. So they continue, by whom the original stanzas were written, where they were found, how H.P. Blavatsky came to record and translate them, and the methods she used to do so are questions outside the scope of this work. On internal evidence, as the professors would say, there is much to discredit the stanzas. And we have to acknowledge that. That is on internal evidence of the usual sort. So they go on. But there is an internal evidence of another sort, one which is not bandied about in dusty lecture rooms, but which speaks in silence in the heart. And on that evidence, the stanzas of Dhyan stand out as a unique and intensely valuable document which will repay our careful study. As a matter of fact, for those of us who are not archaeological fanciers, that is the only sort of evidence or importance that attaches to any document whatever. Even such a book as the Bhagavad Gita draws its authority not from the fact that Sri Krishna is supposed to have spoken it, nor from the fact that Shankaracharya wrote a commentary on it, nor from the fact that many men have revered it, but from its own inherent truth as a description of and guide to the inner life. This is true of all great religious scriptures, and it is the same with the stanzas of Dhyan. They stand upon their own feet and are their own authority. So I think that is useful to keep in mind. Now, remember that HPB points to, indeed, a wisdom religion. I mentioned that word yesterday as synonymous with the oral tradition, the secret doctrine, and so on, is the inheritance of all the nations the world over. And she says, therefore, and this is in the introduction, the records we mean to place before the reader embrace the esoteric tenets of the whole world since the beginning of humanity. And so she says it was the universally diffused religion of the ancient and prehistoric world. Proofs of its diffusion, authentic records of its history, a complete chain of documents showing its character and presence in every land, together with the teaching of all its great adepts, exist to this day in the secret crypts of libraries belonging to the occult fraternity. Now, she mentions, it's rather interesting, she mentions a great number of things in her introduction with regard to what she calls the parent source. Now, whether that source will really be identified is something we really don't know. But I referred yesterday to the work of David Regal, a small pamphlet called The Books of Kyute. And I've put the spelling of this on the board. The Books of Kyute, or the Tibetan Buddhist Tantras. I was very interested when it's part of what's known as the Lam Rin tradition in Tibet. And I was very interested, this is some years ago, 1972, I guess, when a very close friend of mine, Helen Zahara, and I went to see the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala in India, where the Dalai Lama has his residence in exile. And at that time, they had just completed the building of the Tibetan library and archive, containing literally thousands of manuscripts that have been brought out of Tibet at the time that the major migration of the lamas, including the Dalai Lama, escaping from the Chinese. And there also, we met the Dalai Lama's brother, who was in charge of the library, and two young men working on their doctorates from Yale University. And we asked them about the whole Lam Rin library. Now, one of the things that we learned is that the Lam Rin library is an extremely extensive library. It contains really hundreds of volumes, you see, really quite literally, perhaps thousands of volumes, the majority of which have not yet been translated. Now, Regal, who has been a student of Tibetan, has pointed out that there is an identification of the books of Kyute as part of the Lam Rin a whole library, and that they were really part of the Tibetan Buddhist canon, which are known as the Kanjur and Tanjur. And that indeed HPB's statement on this can to a large extent be verified. I mentioned yesterday the papers that were published posthumously of HPB, and which originally consisted of Volume 3 of the Secret Doctrine. It was issued as Volume 3 in 1896. It became Volume 5 of the Adyar edition, and is no longer considered to be actually part of the Secret Doctrine. And so many of these papers appear in the collected writings, Volumes 12, 13, and 14. But they have also been collected, many of them, in a quest book called the Esoteric Writings of HPB. And this is perhaps the easiest way to get a hold of it, because it's, rather than carrying some of the collected writings around, at least you can get a paperback and get some of the basic writings. And section 47 of this deals with the secret books of Lam Rin and Dhyan, in which HPB says that the book of Dhyan, and as I said, this is a difficult word, as we well know, to pronounce, D-Z-Y-A-N, which is indeed the Tibetan for the Sanskrit dhyani. It's the mystic, I spelled that wrong, haven't I? Sorry. Maybe I better put dhyana, because that's the yogic term, which is mystic contemplation, which is really a mystic state of contemplation. And this is a much easier word in one sense to say, dhyani, than dhyan. But this also is cognate with the word jnana, which we had on the board yesterday as cognate with gnosis in the Greek. So that there is a relation among all of these words, you see. And what we're talking about is that interior knowing. So the book of Dhyan, from the Sanskrit Dhyan, mystic meditation, she says, is the first volume of the commentaries upon the 7 secret folios of Kyute, and a glossary of the public works of the same name. 35 volumes of Kyute for exoteric purposes and the use of the layman may be found in the possession of the Tibetan Gelugpa Lamas in the library of any monastery. And indeed, this is true. This indeed has been verified that that is certainly so, and David Riegel goes into that they were very well known. She says, and also 14 books of commentaries and annotations on the same by the initiated teachers. So she says, strictly speaking, those 35 books ought to be termed the popularized version of the Secret Doctrine, full of myths, blinds, and errors. The 14 volumes of commentaries, on the other hand, with their translations, annotations, and an ample glossary of occult terms, worked out from one small archaic folio, the book of the secret wisdom of the world, contain a digest of all the occult sciences. And she says in a footnote that it is from the texts of all these works that the Secret Doctrine has been given. So here is what she says with regard to the source. Now, many people for years said this was unknown. There were no such books. And of course, Western scholars, if they had never heard of the book, it didn't exist. It simply didn't exist. The interesting thing, of course, is that for whatever reason, Tibet has been opened up. And of course, many of these manuscripts now have come out. They're constantly being translated. And these books have now been, the books of Kyute have been positively identified as the Tibetan Buddhist Tantras. And the Book of Dzyan, from which the stanzas were translated, may indeed be one of the lost books, lost in quotes, simply because it hasn't yet been discovered, known as the Mula Kalachakra Tantra, or Mula being root, Kalachakra, the turning of the wheel of time, if you like, which is an interesting phrase, Kalachakra, Tantra. And this, for perhaps several reasons. I've already mentioned that the term Dhyan is the Tibetan phonetic rendering of the Sanskrit jnana, meaning wisdom, which is a result of dhyana, or mystic meditation. But the word jnana, or dhyan, is also the title of the fifth and last section of the Kalachakra Tantra. And so this is well verified. And I must admit, when I stood there these number of years ago in the newly constructed Tibetan library in Dharamsala, in the foothills of the Himalayas, beautiful place, and looked at this pile of palm leaf manuscripts. There they were on the floor, you see, with no shelves yet and so on. Just pile of manuscripts, as you can imagine, palm leaf manuscripts, generally palm leaf, but some kind of, but their manuscripts are very different than our pages, you see. All of these tied together, some of them wrapped in Tibetan scarves and so on, very holy works, you see, brought from the monasteries. You know, my mind, my imagination, somewhere buried in all of that will be the verification of the stanzas. Somewhere buried in all of that. Because they haven't been translated. The vast majority of these have yet to be translated. So there is no question. The Kalachakra teaching has always been considered the special domain of the Panchen Lama and his monastery at Tashu Lumpo, which is located adjacent to Chigatse. And of course, the masters whom HPB acknowledged as her teachers, and HPB herself referred again and again to that very sacred monastery, that great monastery, because it was the major center, it is known, for the Kalachakra studies in Tibet. So all of these things begin to work out. The Kalachakra doctrine is indeed said by the Indo-Tibetan tradition to have come directly from Shambhala. So it's also called the teaching of Shambhala. Now, Shambhala, a sacred place, not only here in the Ojai Valley, which we think is Shambhala, but, you know, and our Lost Horizons was filmed and so on. We have our own minor Shambhala, but that mystic center, which is also, may not be a physical location, but may be part of this great idea of a center from which the oral teachings came up. The first section of the Kalachakra Tantra gives the whole genesis of the world system and its inhabitants. So cosmogenesis and anthropogenesis are indeed the first and second volumes of the Secret Doctrine. So there is increasingly evidence that HPB really knew what she was talking about. I won't pursue that further, except to say that it makes an extremely interesting study that there is now perhaps some historical verification. And so when HPB writes of this fact of the universally diffused wisdom tradition this kept in the secret crypts of libraries belonging to the occult fraternity, I feel there may be evidence that she knew exactly what she was talking about. She says its tenets are now published for the first time, but have been cautiously given out to and taught by more than one European initiate. There remains enough, even among mutilated records, to warrant us in saying that there is in them every possible evidence of the actual existence of apparent doctrine. Fragments have survived geological and political cataclysms to tell the story, and probably have even survived the Chinese invasion of Tibet and have now been brought out into India and will be translated in due time. And so she says, every survival shows evidence that the now secret wisdom was once the one fountainhead, the ever-flowing perennial source at which were fed all its streamlets, the later religions of all nations. One must also recognize, if you are at all familiar with the fact, as I've pointed out, that I've already stated that for HPB, the existence of Mahatmas, of masters, was an absolutely undeniable reality. But therefore one can look at another work, the Mahatma letters themselves, these remarkable letters that were from HPB's teachers, principally to the two Englishmen, A.P. Sinnott and A.O. Hume. And in the very first letter from the Master K.H. to Mr. Sinnott, he refers to himself as a cis and trans-Himalayan cave dweller. And so her teachers are in that tradition. And that is one part of the tradition. It's the tradition in which she was initiated, but not necessarily the tradition, the only tradition which she knew. And that is well testified to by her first work, Isis Unveiled, where she really, for the first time, sort of broke the ground and staggered contemporary thought with saying that there was a wisdom religion. There was indeed a secret doctrine. There was indeed a unifying source of all the great religions and philosophies of the world. That it was a science. It was the science concerning man and the universe. And so I've put on the board the fact that between pages 589 and 593, that should be volume 1. I didn't put that up there. It's volume 1 of Isis Unveiled. She refers to some of these, including, very interestingly, including the sources that can be found on this, in the Western Hemisphere. And she refers to the fact of the individuals mentioned in the Popol Vuh, which is, of course, the sacred work of the Quiche Mayan Indians of Central America. And so we can also find in many other traditions, and she brings them all together. Of course, the later Jewish tradition in the Kabbalah and so on, but the much older traditions. And so it is pointed out, I'm not going to read that, you can look it up for yourselves, of course, but here she had already set the stage in Isis Unveiled in 1877, 11 years earlier, for the fact that there was this great knowledge, this wisdom. But since she was an initiate in what the master himself calls the Cis and Trans-Himalayan school, we may want to look briefly at that. This was also the same school in which probably one of the greatest Advaita Vedantan scholars of the society was also an initiate, T. Subarao, who at one point was, it was suggested, he assist her in the writing of the Secret Doctrine. He is referred to by HPB as the greatest Advaiti of his time, certainly a tremendous scholar, and I refer you to his book. There is a new edition out of it called Esoteric Writings, Theosophical. He's an interesting person to study and to know about in the early days of the Theosophical Society. I just throw that in. He died young. He was, I think, in his 40s, if I remember. May have been earlier than that, something like that. He was a lawyer, an attorney in Madras, an Advaita Vedanta, which of course is what Theosophy is, Advaita, non-dual, and had been suggested that he work with HPB in the presentation of the Secret Doctrine. He did not, for a variety of reasons. They differed, particularly over the classification of the principles, but that's another story. HPB held to the sevenfold classification, and as a true Vedantan, he held to the fourfold classification. Although that is easily reconciled, I may say so, but anyway, not from his point of view. In this work, the Esoteric Writings, there is a very interesting section called the Aryan Arhat Esoteric Tenets on the Sevenfold Principle. It's a letter which he wrote to HPB. And he refers to he says, probably the Aryan, we shall for the present call it by that name. So don't think that this is racist. Unfortunately, you know, in our time, many of these words have been abused, taken over for evil purposes. That's what can happen to words, you know. It's one of the tragedies of our time. A word can suddenly be taken over and used for purposes for which it was never intended. Language has that peculiar characteristic, doesn't it, you see? And so this is what happens. So Aryan, taken up by Hitler, the Germans, that particular, the Nazis, came to have a pejorative meaning, which it was never intended to have. It's a beautiful word. In Sanskrit, it simply means noble. That's all. But he says, and the Chaldeo-Tibetan esoteric doctrines are fundamentally identical, and the secret doctrine of the Jewish Kabbalists merely an offshoot of these. So he says, nothing perhaps can be more interesting now to a student of occult philosophy than a comparison between the two principal doctrines. That is the Aryan and the Chaldeo-Tibetan. So when the master calls himself a Cis and Trans-Himalayan cave dweller, he's referring to, first of all, the Tibetan esoteric doctrine, which is pure or old Buddhism, predating Gautama, the original Buddhism. You remember I had on the board yesterday Bodhidharma as one of the synonyms of this wisdom religion, and that was the original Buddhism. Gautama was the first, it is said, of our humanity to become a Buddha. But the concept of Buddhahood was not by any means introduced only by Gautama. It had always been present as a concept, as a principle, that enlightenment is possible. And Cis-Himalayan is the ancient Aryan doctrine, sometimes called the Brahmanical. The original Vedas, and it's said that the present collection is only a fragment of the original Vedas and very much distorted. It is said came from an area near the Manasarovar Lake in Tibet. And remember that in ancient times, India included Tibet, the Gobi Sea, and other areas with the Himalayan range dividing. So that it came from that area, it is said, the original Vedas, as well as the original Brahmins with their religion of Brahmanism. So it's difficult to say whether the Tibetans derived their doctrine from the ancient rishis of India, or the ancient Brahmins learned their occult doctrines from the adepts of Tibet. But it is from that region. And so one begins to see that there was a common source, and this is what HPB is pointing to. that there was a common source of these teachings, that it's very ancient, was originally an oral tradition, and that all successive philosophies have derived from it. I'm going to stop at this point. Again.